is Radio Prague International, coming to you from the Czech capital.
Hello and welcome. I'm Anna-Marie Regner and you're listening to Czechia in 30 minutes. Coming up on today's program, we look at the clash between the President and Prime Minister over the NATO summit, which is now heading to Constitutional Court. From silent films to Hollywood, Prague's St. Vitus Cathedral shines on the silver screen for almost a century. Then we invite you on a trip around Prague's Jewish quarter. All that coming up later, but first, here's the news brought to you by Vít Bohanka.
News.
Czech President Petr Pavel has asked the Constitutional Court for an interim injunction that would allow him to attend the NATO summit in Ankara in the beginning of July, before the court reaches a final decision in an ongoing competence dispute with the government. According to the court's published filing, Pavel wants the government and foreign ministry ordered to include him in the Czech delegation, secure accreditation for him and his staff, and refrain from obstructing his participation. He argues that representing the state abroad at NATO summits falls within the president's constitutional authority and reflects long-standing practice. Prime Minister Pavel-Babiš from the ANO party dismissed the move as ridiculous and said the government intends to lead foreign policy itself. The Czech Supreme Court has ruled that relatives of people who died as a result of complications linked to the COVID-19 vaccination may be entitled to compensation for emotional suffering. The decision came in the case of a Prague man whose 77-year-old father died from a pulmonary embolism shortly after receiving a third vaccine dose. The court said close family members can claim damages if a death is proven to be causally linked to vaccination. The case will now return to a lower court, which will reconsider the son's claim for compensation. The ruling clarifies how Czech compensation laws apply to COVID vaccination cases. Czech carmaker Škoda Auto has unveiled the Peak, the largest vehicle in its history and the brand's new flagship electric SUV. The 7-seat model will enter production in Mladá Boleslav in the coming weeks, with the first deliveries in Czechia expected around the turn of the year. The Peak offers a driving range of more than 630 kilometers with its larger 91 kilowatt-hour battery, the biggest ever fitted to a Škoda vehicle. Company officials say the model completes Škoda's electric lineup and expect to attract new customers in the growing electric SUV market. Police in Ostrava responded to a shooting on a housing estate on Wednesday after a man shot his wife in the back and then turned the gun on himself. The woman suffered serious injuries and was taken to hospital, but her life is not currently in danger. Officers traced the incident to an apartment in the Ostrava-Zábřeh district. After the man failed to respond to negotiators, police entered the flat and found him dead from a gunshot wound to the head. Police said the suspect had previously been convicted of violent crime and did not legally possess the firearm. The investigation is continuing. State-owned Czech railways will add extra carriages and hundreds of seats on key routes as the summer holidays begin later this week. Additional capacity will be available mainly on services from Prague to Moravia, as well as to South, West and East Bohemia. The operator expects holiday travel to spread over several days because schools finish earlier this year on the 28th of June. Passengers are nevertheless advised to reserve seats in advance, especially on the busy Prague-Ostrava route. With temperatures expected to approach 40 degrees Celsius this weekend, railway authorities are also monitoring tracks and infrastructure for heat-related problems. Czech football coach Miroslav Koubek says the team must believe in a possible upset as they prepare for a decisive World Cup group match against hosts Mexico. The Czechs have just 1 point from 2 games and will likely need a victory to reach the knockout stage. Mexico has already secured first place in the group and are unbeaten in 24 consecutive home matches at the Azteca Stadium. However, Koubek said his players should draw confidence from the March playoffs. when they eliminated Ireland and Denmark to qualify for the tournament. He also admitted he had been unhappy with the team's performances so far and expects a much stronger display in the final group game. Clear skies will prevail across the country on Thursday. Daytime highs will range between 29 and 34 degrees Celsius.
The clash between the Czech head of state and the cabinet over who should attend the upcoming NATO summit in Ankara has now reached the highest court in the land. On Tuesday, President Pavel challenged the government's decision to exclude him from the official delegation on the grounds that it violated his constitutional rights. Daniela Lazarova has the details.
Following weeks of controversy over who would lead the Czech delegation to the NATO summit in Ankara in July, Prime Minister Pavel-Babiš announced on Monday that he himself would take on that role, flanked by Defence Minister Jaromír Zuna and Foreign Minister Petr Matzinka. The governmental team, he said, was in the best position to explain and negotiate decisions on defence spending, since the government alone has executive powers in this respect. He made it abundantly clear that the president, who previously served as chairman of NATO's military committee and who publicly criticised the government for slashing spending on defence, was not wanted on this trip. Petr Pavel, who has attended all NATO summits since taking office in 2023, filed a complaint with the Constitutional Court. He explained the decision in a video on social networks.
I consider the government's decision to exclude the president from the delegation to the summit to be an unprecedented and exceptionally unfortunate step, as well as a restriction of his constitutional powers. I have therefore asked the Constitutional Court to determine who has the authority to decide on the president's participation in the summit and to order the government not to create administrative or other obstacles to the president's exercise of his constitutional powers.
Prime Minister Pavel-Babiš reacted by saying that he respects the president's right to file the lawsuit, but added that he considers the move unfortunate. He said the setup of the delegation to the NATO summit stemmed from practical considerations and stressed that there was no concerted effort to restrict the president's right to represent the country abroad.
I really do not understand the president's reasoning. He has undertaken 61 foreign visits altogether, 10 on a mandate from this government. We recently approved that he would represent the Czech Republic at the autumn session of the UN General Assembly, and the constitution clearly states that all these activities require a mandate from the government.
Babiš said the government would wait for the Constitutional Court's decision before responding further, but stressed that it had no intention of backtracking on the decision. The Constitutional Court is expected to give the case priority and review it immediately. However, even if it does, it is far from certain whether it will pass a verdict in time to alter the government's plans for the upcoming summit. Constitutional law expert Marie Zámečníková says the wording of the respective article is intentionally vague.
The respective article of the law is intentionally drafted in broad terms so that it can serve the given political situation or balance of power and provide room for the actors to negotiate, reach agreements and compromise as the need arises. So to a large extent the constitutional practice is shaped by constitutional conventions.
Whether or not the court will base its ruling on the established tradition that as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, the head of state has represented the country at NATO summits in the past is unclear. However, commentators are already speculating on the wider political consequences of the awaited court verdict and its impact on the standoff between the country's top officials.
Daniela Lazarova with that report. St. Vitus Cathedral, the dominant feature of Prague Castle, is known as the site of coronations, state funerals, and major religious ceremonies. For nearly a century, however, it has also attracted filmmakers, as Romana Grajcarova will now tell you.
Perhaps the most famous Prague landmark, Prague Castle, together with St. Vitus Cathedral, has appeared in films since the very beginning of Czech cinematography, and it is no surprise since only a few buildings can, in just a few seconds, evoke Czech history, fate, power, and statehood. The cathedral already appeared in the silent drama Varhaník u svatého Víta, directed by famous Czech filmmaker Martin Frič in 1929. The film tells the story of an old organist played by the legendary Czech songwriter, actor and director Karel Hašler. Right at the beginning of the film, a shot of the cathedral appears over the panorama of Prague, accompanied by a poetic intertitle.
Nahoře nad městem, jako kamenná stráž boží, tyčí se do
Above the city, like a stone guard of God, rises the Cathedral of St. Vitus into the dusk, its towers connecting the earth with the heavens.
Tyčí se do šera chrám svatého Víta, jehož věže spojují zemi s nebesy.
However, the monumental cathedral did not star only in poetic stories. Directors also used it when they wanted to emphasize important moments in Czech history. This is clearly visible, for example, in the film Attentat about Operation Anthropoid, or in the opening shots of the Czech series Kamarádi, where it immediately anchors the story in a Czech setting. The cathedral also attracted foreign filmmakers. In 2001, it appeared in the film A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger, although its identity was slightly concealed. To recognize it, viewers really need a sharp eye, because although the facade of the Prague Cathedral was filmed, in the movie the main character is supposed to be in Paris in front of Notre Dame Cathedral. In 2006, St. Vitus Cathedral also appeared in the Danish film Prague with Mads Mikkelsen. This time, however, it is no longer a backdrop for major historical turning points, but part of a melancholic portrait of a contemporary city. Here, Prague becomes a place of memories, the search for one's identity, and painful personal decisions. Few Czech buildings are as photogenic. Its Gothic towers, monumental interiors, and exceptional position above the city continue to attract filmmakers to this day. Thanks to this, Prague Castle has also appeared in a number of other international productions. And although the camera often captures mainly the courtyards or just the panorama of Hradčany, the silhouette of the cathedral is usually one of the most distinctive landmarks of Prague.
Thank you, Romana Grajcarova, for that report. A reminder that you're with Czechia in 30 minutes, a half hour of news, current affairs, and interesting stories brought to you by Radio Prague International. We now invite you to join us on a trip to Prague's Jewish Quarter with Ruth Frankova.
The Jewish Quarter, also known as Josefov, is one of the most popular tourist destinations in Prague, located between the Old Town Square and the Vltava River. A Jewish ghetto was established here in the 12th century. At the turn of the 19th century, a large part of the ghetto was demolished. Fortunately, most of the significant buildings were saved from destructions, and today they represent the best preserved complex of historical Jewish monuments in Europe. Jakub Schwab, a tour guide and a long-time member of the Jewish community, kindly took me around the district. We started our walk on Pařížská Street, right next to the old new synagogue.
The Pařížská, or so-called Paris Street, full of Prague's most luxurious brand stores, was built on the ruins of the former Jewish ghetto. On the turn of the 19th and the 20th century, actually the old Jewish quarter got almost completely torn down, with the exceptions of like 6 synagogues, the building of the Jewish town hall, and most of the Jewish cemetery, and an entirely new Art Nouveau neighborhood was built on top of that.
Since much of Josefov used to be frequently flooded by the Vltava River, the terrain of the newly built neighborhood was raised by about 2 meters. As a result, the old new synagogue stands below the level of Bařížská, and there is a staircase leading to its entrance. The small building with a high saddle roof and late Gothic brick gables was initially called the New Synagogue because the old synagogue was already in existence on Dushny Street. When new synagogues were constructed at the end of the 16th century, the old New Synagogue got its current name.
The synagogue, which is called the Old New Synagogue, starts the celebration of its 750th anniversary this year. I say starts because the exact date of construction is uncertain, and it was built somewhere between 1270 and 1290, and it's considered to be the oldest constantly active synagogue outside Israel.
There are many legends tied to the old new synagogue, but the most famous one is the legend of Prague Golem, an artificial being made out of clay from the banks of the Vltava River. Its creator was Rabbi Lev, an important 16th century Talmudic scholar, Jewish mystic and philosopher, who for most of his life served as a leading rabbi in Prague and Mikulov.
There is basically a Kabbalistic concept that a person who is faithful and learned enough to know the exact sequence of the 27 letters of name of the god, so such a person can create a sort of robot and put it alive by placing a parchment with this sequence to the head of the robot. And by this, the robot receives the 2 lower stages of human soul, which means that the golem is able to obey instructions and to have unlimited energy, but it's not able to speak and it's not able to think, because these are attributes attached to the 3rd level of the human soul.
The golem was supposed to protect the Jews against pogroms and help them with hard physical labor. Before the Shabbat, the Jewish day of rest, the rabbi removed the parchment from its head to keep the golem still. One day, however, he forgot to do so.
You know, in the traditional Jewish world until today, Friday afternoon is the biggest rush. Everybody prepares for the Shabbat, and also everyone tries to accomplish things that he was unable to accomplish throughout the whole week. So it's very easy to forget something. And simply the rabbi forgot to remove the parchment. So what happened? The energy concentrated in the golem started to look for the way out, and the golem was not receiving any instructions, so it started to set fire in the ghetto. And here inside the old new synagogue, the rabbi was approached by someone from the outside and said, "Rabbi, your golem is destroying the city." At that moment, the Maharal realized the mistake and made interruption in the service, went outside, found the golem, and moved the parchment away.
After some thinking, the rabbi realized that it would be irresponsible to leave the golem and its unbound energy in people's hands. He decided not to bring it back to life again. Instead, after Shabbat, he hid the golem to the attic of the old new synagogue.
We are actually seeing the attic up here, and the ladder in the wall is basically considered to be the only, at this moment, known access to there. And up there, the golem is sleeping and waiting for the worst time in the history of the Prague Jews to come down and to help again.
And what we can hear right now is actually the bell on the Jewish Town Hall, which is another building that survived the clearance of the Jewish ghetto. So can you tell us a little bit more about this building, or rather it's a complex of several buildings?
We are basically talking about two buildings that we can see from this point: the Jewish Town Hall and the High Synagogue closer to us. Now, both were initially built more or less at the same time, meaning on the break of the 15 and 1600s, by the same person, and the person's name was Mordechai Meisel, who at the same time was the head of the Jewish town, the head of the Jewish community actually, as well as the court Jew of Rudolf II, the Emperor of Austria. Basically, the Jewish Town Hall was built for the purposes of the Jewish community to have all the offices for the officials as well. Now the synagogue next to it, which is called the High Synagogue, as I have said, as we see, the three big Renaissance windows are at the first floor. That's why it's called High Synagogue, because the services were always held on the first floor, not on the street level.
Can we also mention the clock on the Jewish Town Hall, because what's interesting is that it actually goes counterclockwise.
There are basically two clocks. Up at the tower there is a regular clock, and we heard the bells ringing. And down here is a Hebrew clock, which is very specific, as you have mentioned, because it's functioning also, and it goes from the right to the left. It's not exactly known why it was made like that. Probably the consideration of the clockmaster was, if by the Jews everything goes from the right to the left, so the clocks as well. We know it's not true, but it was done like this and became one of the Prague's very specific, very famous Jewish sites.
From the Jewish Town Hall, Jakub Schwab takes me toward the Jewish cemetery. We pause in front of two buildings which are housing permanent exhibitions of Prague's Jewish Museum.
The first one is the Klausen Synagogue, which was built in 1696. It's the only of the Prague's preserved synagogues that was built in the Baroque style. And the other building, which looks very old, but it's not that old, is called the Ceremonial Hall of the Prague's Jewish Burial Society. Now the matter is that the building, which is built in neo-Romanesque style, was built only at the beginning of the 20th century, but the cemetery was not in use since 1787. So at the very beginning it was built for some ceremonial purposes of the Prague's Burial Society, but after a few years, yet before World War I, the Jewish Burial Society received entirely new building of headquarters on the other side of the cemetery. So this became, already before World War I, one of the first exhibition halls of the Jewish Museum of Prague.
Established in 1906, the Jewish Museum in Prague is in fact one of the oldest Jewish museums in Europe. At the core of its collections were items from synagogues that had been demolished as a result of the clearance of the Jewish ghetto. During the war, it became a safe haven for liturgical objects, books and documents from the defunct Jewish communities around the country.
As the Nazis decided to bring into Prague Jewish sacred objects from the whole of the era of today's Czech Republic, basically. So they used the structure and the people working in the Jewish Museum in order to make catalogs of that, because they wanted to know what they have, basically. After the war, though, most of the Jewish communities on the territory were not renewed anymore, and there was nowhere to return these objects. And in 1950, the museum got nationalized and worked as a state Jewish museum until it was turned into a corporation under control of the Federation of the Jewish Communities and the Ministry of Culture of the Czech Republic in the 1990s.
Apart from the Clausen Synagogue and the Ceremonial Hall, the Jewish Museum is also in charge of other buildings, including the Pinkas Synagogue, the second oldest preserved synagogues in Prague. Today it serves as a memorial to the nearly 80,000 Jewish victims of the Holocaust from the Czech lands. It also administers the Old Jewish Cemetery, one of the oldest surviving Jewish burial grounds in the world.
It was definitely not the first Jewish cemetery in Prague, but it's the oldest Jewish cemetery that we can see in Prague. No one knows when it was exactly established, but the earliest known gravestone is dated back to 1439 and belongs to Rabbi Avigdor Kara, who as a young man was one of the witnesses of the cruelest pogrom against the Jews in the history of Prague, which took place in 1389. The cemetery was used until 1787, when a law came from the court of Joseph II, the Emperor of Austria, which banned any future burials from the city centers. So the Jewish community first went to Žižkov, to other neighborhood of Prague, and since 1890 the current Jewish cemetery of Prague is being used at the Želivského metro station in the era of all the main cemeteries of Prague.
The most important figures buried at the Old Jewish Cemetery include the scholar and teacher Rabbi Lev and the mayor of the Jewish town hall, Mordechai Meisel. You can also see the tombstone of David Gans, a Renaissance scholar, historian, mathematician and astronomer, and many others. Jakub Schwab says people interested in Jewish history should also venture outside the Jewish quarter to pay a visit to the Spanish synagogue located near the city's main train station.
One can also find a very beautiful exhibition about the Jewish life in Prague after the Second World War until the present. And that's something that, according to my opinion, shouldn't be missed and shouldn't be forgotten, that, Jewish Prague is not only history, but also presence.
And that trip to Prague's Jewish Quarter brings us to the end of today's broadcast. You can find more news and stories on our website at www.radio.cz. You can also follow us on Facebook, X, and Instagram. This is Anna-Marie Regner saying thanks for listening and goodbye.